Well, everything I've been saying so far is essentially some basic background material for what this course is essentially about, namely how to understand the Jewish heritage that has been left behind in Poland after the Holocaust. Well, from this very brief outline, it should be pretty clear how hard it is to find room for suitable attention to the Holocaust itself, however important it is. Where does one put the Holocaust? Into the history section? Into the demography section? Into the culture section? Well, I'll be coming back to that a little bit later on, but before we start on that, there's two more aspects I'd like to introduce you to first, namely, first of all, the situation of the Polish Jewish heritage as seen in present-day local Polish perspective, and that is to say, as regards the setting of this heritage in wider society in this country, and secondly, the situation of Jewish heritage as seen in present-day Jewish perspective. The nature of heritage in general is a complicated subject, and during this course I will keep coming back to it. All I want to do in this lecture is to indicate the very broad scope of this interdisciplinary subject and just make a few general and introductory points. First of all, the concept of heritage is of course very closely connected with the nature of cultural memory. And there is a large technical and theoretical literature on the subject. The French sociologist Pierre Nora made an influential proposal way back in the 1980s that what becomes thought of as a heritage site is what he called a lieu de mémoire, a place of memory, which very roughly means a place where memory is being made for some particular present-day purpose, therefore following quite new rules and conventions about how to commemorate something which once existed in the past. To give one simple example of this idea, present-day Auschwitz would need to be understood as a place of memory and therefore as a heritage site because, from Nora's perspective, because of the very specific memory-making procedures commemorating what once happened there, such as the construction of national Polish identity through the emphasis there on Polish victimhood, or alternatively, the use of the place by Jewish groups who see the Holocaust as an important part of their present-day identity. Heritage, in other words, relates to the attempt to bring history and memory together for the purpose of constructing identity. In recent decades, heritage has become enormously fashionable, not only in Europe but around the world, to encourage both national or local identities through developing a new understanding and a new relationship with the past. Heritage thus intersects with educational policies of all kinds. Now, what happened in Krakow in recent years is that the Kazimierz district and its synagogues have specifically been turned into heritage, Jewish heritage, both for tourism purposes and also as part of the city's plan for urban renewal and gentrification. In other words, in this perspective, it's not as if the heritage already existed. No, the area has been deliberately transformed. Heritage has been deliberately constructed in line with both general heritage strategies in many other countries and also specifically Jewish heritage strategies in various places in Europe, such as Venice or Prague, where the city authorities have done pretty much the same thing as what has happened in Kazimierz. Of course, in all these places, the synagogue buildings were there, but the energy and the resources, and indeed the money, to turn them into what is now called Jewish heritage and places of memory, that all was a conscious decision. This decision to consciously create and devote a section of the city for the purpose of presenting a Jewish heritage is also a cultural decision with strong cultural and symbolic consequences, because in all these places where Jewish heritage has been developed, three important features apply. Number one, an important local Jewish history going back several centuries, often with important Jewish personalities about whom there's usually a lot to say, including famous rabbis, famous philosophers, famous artists, famous writers, famous local Jewish politicians, industrialists, and philanthropists. Secondly, the absolute sense of tragedy and catastrophe, because the local Jewish population has almost completely disappeared through the mass deportation and murder of the Jews during the Holocaust, which left Kazimierz after the war as a ghost town full of abandoned slums. Thirdly, the need for cultural specialists who know how to present as Jewish heritage the buildings and other artifacts that have been left behind. For example, by creating museums, by training local people as guides for visitors, and indeed for creating all the necessary tourist infrastructure. The Jewish heritage that is today publicly visible in Kraków has enormous emotional and symbolic power, particularly because the Jewish community that gave rise to it disappeared so very suddenly, leaving behind an area of the city precisely without those original inhabitants who built and sustained that public heritage and its buildings over several centuries. In other words, an important part of the meaning of the whole concept of Jewish heritage in a place like Kraków relates to what is often called a strong sense of absent presence. The heritage is there, it is present, but the people are now not there. They are absent. So Jewish heritage then thus rests on a paradox. And in that sense, it's rather different from the constructed national heritage of a particular country, which of course has its native speakers of the local language, its educational institutions, and its cultural specialists. The European Jewish heritage often has none of these at the local level. On the contrary, in most of these places in Europe where Jewish heritage has been promoted, there is only a very small Jewish community nowadays and a very small circle of cultural specialists who know Jewish languages and the details of the Jewish religion and cultural heritage, such as the theology and artistic conventions of the Jewish painted art of the synagogue that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Nowadays, the specialists are usually not Jewish themselves, and they need to be trained, often done, as in Kraków, through the development of a Jewish studies department at a local university. And one of the central institutions of the transformation process is, of course, the Jewish Museum. However, in addition to the specialists, there is usually another population to be found in Kazimierz and also in other places in Europe where Jewish heritage has been constructed. I'm referring here to those who promote popular Jewish culture, such as klezmer concerts, as well as commercial investors in Jewish themes, in Jewish-themed cafes and restaurants, as well as souvenir shops. In other words, heritage involves many actors and stakeholders in the transformation process. It relates simultaneously to town planners, Jewish agencies, heritage organizations, and those who invest in tourism. In other words, the production of heritage is a rather complex affair. For example, a synagogue which is treated as part of the local Jewish heritage is simultaneously of interest to local authorities and town planners, Jewish leaders who see it also as a Holocaust memorial of some kind in memory of the Jews who used to pray there, conservationists who want to ensure that as part of the local Jewish heritage it is properly safeguarded in artistic and architectural terms, and then of course the travel agencies who treat the place as a museum for tourists to visit and gaze at. Turning synagogues into monuments thus involved many different kinds of stakeholders, some of whom may, of course, be in conflict and rivalry with each other. For example, the progressive synagogue is simultaneously a synagogue, because it is sometimes used as a synagogue, but otherwise it's been substantially restored as a Jewish heritage site and used as a museum for which tourists have to buy a ticket in order to get inside. And it's also occasionally used as a concert hall or lecture hall. That progressive synagogue is a Jewish space in a city largely without Jews today, and in that way fairly typical of the complicated reality of Jewish heritage in Kazimierz and elsewhere in southern Poland.